Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Scouse Science Podcast. My name is Professor Tom Solomon. I'm here at the University of Liverpool, and I'm joined by two guests today, Sally Sheard and Frank Cottrell Boyce. Say hello, guys.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, and through the wonders of Zoom, we also have lots of people joining us. But the first thing I'm going to get you all to do is modify your Zoom slightly so that you can see the three of us a bit more clearly. Those who are not very familiar with Zoom, I'll talk you through it slowly. You'll see a box in the middle, lots of boxes with people's names on. And if you go to any box with somebody's name on, I'm doing Jamie box. He's not called Jamie box because he's in a box. There's a little thing in the corner with three dots. And if you click on the three dots, and then you see a drop-down menu and you click hide non-video participants. And if you do that now, all the boxes will disappear and you'll just be left with the three of us. So, good. Let's assume most people have done it. Great, there we are. Hi guys. Have you done it? Frank, have you done it? And Sally?
I have, yeah. I'm going to miss those little guys, but...
Yeah. Now, you two, of course, are old hands at Zoom. I will say people can send us messages. So if you're struggling to do it and want a personalized instruction through the chat about how to do it, send a message on the chat function of Zoom, and someone will help you. And also, this is being streamed live by Facebook. So people can send in messages by Facebook or via the chat function. And we're really interested to hear your comments, your questions. So do send them through to us. So this is the first Scouse Science Podcast. We thought it'd be fun to get together one of our great scientists at the University of Liverpool and one of our famous faces locally and have a chat. So that's exactly what we're going to do. First of all, let me allow them to introduce themselves. So Sally, first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Sally Sheard. I'm, how to start? I'm a health policy historian. I'm head of the Department of Public Health Policy and Systems at the University of Liverpool, and I'm the Andrew Geddes and John Rankin Chair of Modern History.
Fantastic, thanks. And Frank?
Hi, I'm Frank Cottrell Boyce. I'm a children's writer and a film writer. There you go.
Great, brilliant. Now, again, just before we start, we'd like everyone to, so that we know the chat function is working, just send us in a chat message about where you're listening from. We're quite interested in where people are hearing us from. So let us know where you are, maybe even what you're up to. Now, Zoom, love it, hate it, but it's the only way we can operate at the moment. And this is our first podcast together. But I was going to ask you both, what's your favorite podcast, or what's the weirdest podcast you've come across? Sally first.
I listen to two on a regular basis, This American Life and The Memory Palace, both of which I'd highly recommend. Memory Palace is brilliant, really short episodes. There was one they did a few weeks ago, which was called Stories to Wash Your Hands By, 20 minutes, 20-second stories, absolutely fantastic.
Great, okay, we'll look out for those. And Frank, any podcasts you'd like to recommend or suggest we avoid?
I listen to This American Life as well. I also use the Duolingo podcasts, which are great, really helpful. And of late, since lockdown, I've become completely addicted to the More or Less podcast and its daughter podcast, they're both done by Tim Hartford, which is 50 Things That Made the Modern World.
Right, great. Well, lots of things for us all to listen to there. But anyway, let's get on with our own podcast today. For what it's worth, the ones I like are Louis Theroux. Have you listened to that one?
Oh, yeah.
Locked at Home with Louis Theroux. And the coronavirus newscast on BBC with the Laura Kuenssberg and others. And I've appeared on that a couple of times as well, which was actually where I got the idea that this would be quite good fun to do.
Okay.
So let's start with Sally anyway. You are our scientist today. Now, most people, when they think of science, they think of people in white coats in laboratories, and you're a social scientist. And I was quite keen to get you on the first one because I know it can be quite irritating that wet science, lab science, is the only thing people ever think of. So tell us a little bit more about what it is to be a social scientist, what it means.
Well, I think you've started off on the right tack. Absolutely, Tom. Thank you very much. So modern science has three branches. There's natural sciences, social sciences, and formal sciences. And people talk about science as just being, the default is always it's natural science, it's biology, chemistry, physics. It's the stuff that my son does in his wet lab in Leeds wearing his white coat. It's the stuff you do, Tom, in your labs. Social science is the study of societies, and it is an equally important part. You cannot have one branch of science without having the others. You need all three legs of that tripod if you're going to have good knowledge. And that's what science means. It's the Latin word for knowledge. So social sciences, the sorts of terms that people will come across are sociology, psychology, economics, geography, and history. So I'm a history scientist. My colleagues, if they're listening, they'll be a bit puzzled if you're introducing me as a scientist, because it's not a word that's often associated with history.
And so you talked about how important it is to have these different strands and how important the social science is to, I guess, ensure delivery of things that are learned in labs and in wards and hospitals. When it doesn't work out, give us examples where things have not, happened like they might have done because the social scientists weren't involved as they could have been or should have been. Because it's all, the truth is, for most of us scientists, I mean, I'm just about getting the hang of the kind of things you do. And that's why I was very keen to get you on first. But, if most of us are still struggling, give us examples of where it's done well or done badly.
Well, we talked about this back in January when we launched the Centre of Excellence for Infectious Diseases Research in Liverpool. And I gave a presentation then. And I said, epidemics are not just biological, they're political, they're social, they're economic, they're cultural. And I think if you look back at how we've handled epidemics, pandemics in the past, you will see the absence of social science in the policy responses to those. So they bring in the traditional scientists from biology, they do transmission modelling of viruses, but what they don't do automatically is bring in the social scientists at the same time. So that's where we need to get better. And I think that's what we can do with COVID-19. We're beginning to see that happening. Yeah,
so I was going to ask you about that. I mean, we're in the middle of this pandemic. What have you been doing? What's been different for you, and how have you been helping address some of the problems with the pandemic?
Well, my usual research projects are around the interface between policymakers and expert advisors. So this is perfect territory for me. And quite quickly after we realised that this was going to be something that would run for weeks, well, we were thinking weeks or months then, we put in a funding request to get funding to do a study on the policy dynamics of COVID-19. So that's one piece of work that I'm doing alongside the day job. The other thing I'm doing, which is absolutely fascinating, and it's a real privilege, is I'm working very closely with Matt Ashton, who is the Director of Public Health for Liverpool City Council. And traditionally, we had very close relationship between universities and local authorities when it came to public health, and we're beginning to rebuild that in Liverpool. And what I'm doing with Matt is I'm co-chairing a health intelligence group and making sure that we get the best intelligence through from all types of science into that local COVID response.
And what difference is that making in practical terms? What does that mean is happening that might not otherwise be happening?
It means that we are able to access all of the expertise we have locally in universities, not just Liverpool, but more broadly, particularly around things like modelling of transmission of diseases. We're also able to access researchers who we have working in our communities on a regular basis and say to them, look, we'd really like to go into some households and understand local people's reactions, responses to COVID. Can you help us get that sort of access? So it's freeing up, I think, some of the ways in which we generate new knowledge within our city.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I was thinking back to, trying to underscore the importance of social science. I suppose people, often hear it said that in terms of medical science, if we just applied all the things we've already discovered, then the world would be a much healthier place. And that, what tends to happen is there's all these great discoveries, there's all these clinical projects, there's all this lab science. And in a sense, we know what we need to do. It's just, and the social science helps us do it. We know how to reduce lung cancer. We just need to stop people smoking. There's so many examples of that. And in some respects, social science is trying to make sure we apply some of the things we're learning. Is that a reasonable summary, would you say?
it needs to go both ways. We need to apply lessons from social science and natural science, and vice versa. Policy making is a really messy business, but it's not a linear, natural thing that happens. You don't just get the evidence and then you get the policy. If you look at something like smallpox eradication, so they discovered in 1798 how to prevent smallpox, and it took nearly 200 years for smallpox to be eradicated worldwide. That's a really good example of where you've got the knowledge, but how do you mobilize that knowledge? We see that in so many different environments. So the best policy is the policy that is informed by all types of science, social science and natural science.
Fantastic, thanks. Frank, what have you been doing since the lockdown began? Or since the outbreak began, the pandemic began?
In a profound way, it's no change to me, because as my next door neighbour, your friend, said to me when I first moved in, so you've condemned yourself to a lifetime of homework. And I've had this kind of weird inversion where actually, because of the lockdown, I'm actually more accessible to people, because normally geography is a good way of pushing people away, saying, no, I can't come to Los Angeles because of this, or no, I can't go and visit your school in Southampton because it's too far away. And suddenly everybody, I'm very, very accessible. Kind of one thing that, crosses over with Sally is that at the very beginning of lockdown, I was talking about whether writers would want to write about the pandemic or not, because in a weird way, like, you always write about something exceptional, and the pandemic is happening to everybody. So we're all having that experience, and that's kind of democratic, but kind of weird as well. And somebody said to me, but you've already written a book about a pandemic, which I'd completely forgotten that I wrote a book called The Astounding Broccoli Boy a few years ago, which is about a viral pandemic in which two children are the heroes. And so I decided to read that on Instagram as a kind of Jackanory thing. Like, one thing that writers can do, and lots of writers and illustrators have done, is provide like free online creative writing. I've been doing creative writing lessons because I'm kind of aware of people who don't have gardens and how difficult it is to entertain your children if you don't have a garden. So I thought, I can do this. So I was doing creative writing lessons, and I was Jackanorying this story. And it was really, really interesting to see what you could imagine and what I had imagined, which was incredibly accurate. There was lots of lockdown, London was empty. There was even sections about animals coming back into gardens and stuff like this, but also what you couldn't imagine, what's unimaginable and what is imaginable. And I think the crossover with Sally is that when you're talking about policy, the greatest policy tool, the most powerful policy tool, is narrative, and right at the beginning. And so it's policy is a mixture of law, scientific innovation, but also of news, which is narrative. So right at the very beginning of this lockdown, we had images that were very familiar of panic buying and all that stuff, and they kind of seemed to be like the beginning of 28 Days Later or Contagion, a narrative that we're very used to, which is that, society is a veneer. You break the veneer, we'll all end up eating each other in 2 weeks. And then there was another narrative that came in very, very quickly, which is like neighbors, rainbows in windows, WhatsApp groups, in which technology became a very, very important part of that. And that there seemed to be kind of middle eight of the pandemic where there was greater social cohesion than ever. That people were shopping for each other, were more aware of each other. I think quite an interesting thing took place with regard to kind of online, which is that I think the word community had begun to shift meaning from your geographical location into your interest group. That like community was the people that you had to live cheek by jowl with, whether you liked them or not. And as a Catholic, I'm in a parish with people that I've got nothing else in common with but the fact that we see each other at least once a week, and that we're very, very different from each other. And community was coming to mean something which was a group of people online who all believe exactly the same thing. And if one of them deviates even a little bit, they get cancelled. And there was kind of a reversion to a more geographical sense of community. And then I think over the last few weeks, as people have realized that actually we're not all in this together, I think culturally the Cummings thing, however trivial the incident in itself was, has been a bit of a turning point in terms of the national mood and the narrative. I think the narrative is very, very important. The power of the Blitz spirit narrative, for instance, however dubious that is historically, was very, very useful in the middle. So I think the stories that we tell each other become very, very, very important, and who's telling those stories is important. And narrative as a tool of policy is something that I've thought about a lot.
I think who's telling the stories is a really significant issue, and I think we've seen a lot of interest during this pandemic about who is fronting the government's response, and when they're choosing to put up political people like ministers, and when they're choosing to put up their scientific experts such as Tom. I wonder, Tom, have you got any views on that?
Well, actually, there's a few things that Frank's mentioned that I just wanted to look into a little bit more. And I will come back to that. I'm not dodging it. My brother, every time I appear, he sends me terrible text messages afterwards saying, why don't you just answer the question? And he doesn't understand that you can answer the question, but you sometimes want to frame it a little bit into a context rather than just a simple yes or no. So I promise I'll come back to that. And if I forget, remind me. But I just wanted to come back. So it was the Astounding Broccoli Boy, was it, the book?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what made you decide to write a book about a
viral pandemic? I mean, that's a long story, but it's about a boy who changes colour, and it turns out that this is a symptom of a respiratory. It's actually a respiratory tract virus, which is possibly conveyed by cats. So in the book, it's called Killer Kittens. And it's because, I mean, I want to ask you privately about this, but I have a blood condition myself, which makes me change colour when I'm under stress. So it just came from a very personal thing about that. Yeah. And I'm trying to kind of build a story out of it. And also like to take on those stories about, I believe quite strongly and philosophically in human nature, in the goodness of human nature. I think the problem of why we are good to each other is much more interesting than the question of why we're bad to each other. So I did kind of want to take on that kind of Contagion, 28 Days Later type of narrative and see what would happen if you flipped it. And the world became a better place. And
it did. So all this kind of the community spirit and people working together and not, the society not falling apart. That was the narrative of your story, was it?
Yeah, I'm really, really interested in that. And I think that there's been kind of a lot of people making an analogy with war. And with the war, of which the British feel dangerously nostalgic and misled about, but still. And I think at the end of the war, one thing that people always don't talk about is the fact that we threw Churchill out and kind of rebooted society. And certainly for some length of this lockdown, it seemed to me that there was an opportunity here to talk about what could be different. What could you do differently? What will we do differently? And certainly in the arts, there's a lot of talk about there's no going back, certainly for theatre and for venues, there's no going back. So everything has to be reimagined. And that huge kind of imaginative opportunity seems to be, at that moment, feels to me like it's fading, but that might be just me.
Yeah. I better answer this question. I can already see 20 messages from my brother. So what was it was about government response and who they put up. And I think you're right, Sally. It is really interesting how sometimes it's a minister, sometimes they point to the chief scientific advisor, chief medical officer. But I'm never put up by the government. I appeared in quite a lot of things, but I'm not there representing them. And although I sit on an advisory committee, that's kind of advice that goes into the melting pot. So I think, have I answered the question? I think I have. But the role of the chief medical officer is a really interesting one. Chris Whitty's a friend of mine. I was at medical school with him about 300 years ago. And Sally, you of course have done a really interesting work with all the previous chief medical officers. I think, is it the previous 4?
Yes.
Or you did something with them. I mean, I hope, but I know you've done stuff with them. Tell us a bit about that. Maybe I've got that wrong, but tell us, I know you've done stuff. Maybe you've analysed what they've done. Tell us a bit about that and how you think they might have responded in this outbreak.
Yes, I mean, this goes back a long way in my academic career, but when I had some associations with Ken Kalman when he was chief medical officer in the 1990s, I did a piece at his leaving reception, and the new incoming chief medical officer, Liam Donaldson, came up to me and he said, I'm really interested in history I don't know anything about the role I'm taking on, which worried me a bit. And he said, would you like to collaborate? And I'd really like to know what the previous 14 chief medical officers have done, because the post was established in 1855. And I thought it was a brilliant opportunity. So Liam and I wrote a book together, and I pulled it off the shelf earlier because I thought I love the cover. I spent ages.
Good. No, that's great. Fantastic.
Cover.
Plug-a-lulia, as they say on the Frank Skinner
Absolutely,
show.
absolutely. It's now out of print, of course.
Hold it up again. Just hold it up a little bit longer. I'm not sure everyone caught it.
There you go.
Great.
Complete with stethoscope. And with hindsight, I thought that was such the wrong message to send, because the chief medical officer is not just about medicine. They are about health and about promoting good health. So what I did in that book was to look at how previous CMOs had problems, whether it was pandemics, the 1918 influenza pandemic, which the chief medical officer didn't handle very well then, but also how they've had tensions with government over the years. And a brilliant example, I've been thinking about this so much when I've watched the news reports. When you have either the Prime Minister or the Minister of Health flanked by his two scientific advisors. And there's a parallel here with 1954, when they were first announcing the link between smoking and lung cancer. And the minister then, a chap called Ian MacLeod, sat at a desk in front of the journalists. He had his CMO on one side, head of the MRC on the other side, and he read a report. And he was really reluctant to do this, I should say, because the Treasury didn't want people to stop smoking because they needed the revenue to pay for the NHS. And so he read this report. He said, I have a duty to tell you that there is an association between smoking and lung cancer. Guess what he was doing while he read the statement? Yeah, not one, but 4 cigarettes. He chain smoked, lighting each from the last. And the impact was just, the next day it wasn't front page news. It was page 4 of the Times, tiny article, and it had no impact on people's smoking habits. So that's where you get the government probably misusing their scientific advisors. And that's just one example, I think, of quite a long pattern of that sort of activity.
So are you saying, how deliberate do you think that was, Sally? Do you think he's just addicted and he couldn't stop smoking? Or do you think that is a piece of theatre, where, yes, I've got yes, I'm doing everything you told me to, but I can smoke, that the smoking is a signal to undermine it?
I think it's a very deliberate signal. And he probably was, that level of addiction that he wouldn't even have thought about it. And then, 1950s, 80% of British men smoked.
Yeah.
So it's introducing really quite a radical idea.
And just quite interesting, that idea of allowing the information to get out, but doing so in bad faith. Because another kind of story that we've not talked about, but is very prevalent, is the conspiracy theory thing, where Tom takes his walk in the mornings to Hightown. Someone's written, I don't know if you've seen this yet, they've written on the tarmac, fake COVID figures to control your data, and so that, and when a government acts in a kind of bad faith way, when they act in a conspiratorial manner, that produces conspiracy theory. And that is part of why there is that lag of 200 years between getting rid of smallpox, is that the real power of the narrative and policy is, for these big scale things, you need consent, you need people to believe in it, and you need people to buy into it. And if you do that in bad faith, then they won't buy into it, and they won't lock down, or you'll get anti-vaxxers or whatever.
Yeah.
The story is the persuasion, isn't it? And the persuasion is almost as important as the technology.
Yeah, it is. Now, I'm just going to pause there because we have promised that we will take some of the questions from those listening in. So let's feed some of these in, questions and comments, and then we will carry on with our own discussion. But I'll be in trouble if I don't do what we said we'd do. Question about...
It's Tom's brother, look.
No, Bruce is all right. Bruce is he's happy now. Question is about community. Sally, you talked about the community study and going into houses. Somebody wants clarity. Do you mean physically going into houses, or is it via this kind of messaging?
They will be physically going into houses. They'll be sending in people who are fully equipped in PPE to take biological samples, blood samples, but then there will be follow-up questionnaires that were done by post. So we're absolutely, I want to reassure the person who sent that message in that we are abiding by all of the regulations when it comes to accessing individuals for our studies.
Thank you very much. And a question for Frank about church closures. You've talked about communities, and obviously churches closing has a big impact on that. What are your thoughts on that, and how are people getting around that?
Oh, that's been so interesting. I mean, like the church closure thing obviously impacts on older people quite hard, because that is where, I mean, personally, that's where I've kept an eye on the old people. You know, apart from the religious aspect of it, that is where there are old people who I take care to kind of say hello to and make sure they're there and wonder why they're not there. So that's kind of increased isolation. And also the churches generally usually have some kind of outreachy thing. So like I used to collect from our 2 bakeries, Waterfields and Satterthwaite's, and take them into the homeless shelter on a Friday. Obviously that had to stop. Because the bakeries themselves closed down. So there's all that kind of spin-off thing. You know, church is not just about worship. From the worship point of view, and this is another thing that's maybe not within the portfolio of this, but like church worship went onto line completely seamlessly. Like it was kind of very moving to see these very often quite elderly priests grasp the technology, take it online, and a kind of whole different kind of imaginative relationship with the technology happening almost straight away. Very, very, very quickly they adapted to that, and that was very moving, but kind of interesting as well, because I've got very, you know, as someone who's trying to write, you know, anyone who writes has a very conflicted relationship with technology, because on the one hand it's this amazing tool, and on the other hand it's this terrible distraction that gets you sucked into this daily circus and is very, very hard to control. And I'm very, very interested to hear what people think will change in our relationship with technology, because obviously this has been, in one sense, an incredibly benign, life-saving tool that we're using here and now. And on the other hand, it is the great propagator of all the conspiracies and a great kind of stirrer of the pot of anxiety. It's both a cure for isolation and a kind of promoter of isolation at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. What will go back and what will continue? I mean, Sally, what do you think? Our working practice has changed. I mean, for me, because I do some lab work, although my people who work with me would say they try and keep me out of the lab as much as possible, but I do at least have an excuse to come into the building. You know, in theory, many people could forever just work at home on the end of a computer, but what do you think will happen in the future? Do you think people will come back onto, you know, normal working practices?
I hope there will be at least a partial return. I really value having that direct face-to-face contact with individuals. I find Zoom quite a challenge. I think it takes more concentration to do meetings, particularly big meetings by Zoom, because you've got that slight disconnect between pictures. You've got people looking directly at you. So I would like to see a mix, a hybrid. I really enjoy being on campus, and I think for universities it's important that we have those opportunities for the sort of serendipitous interactions. That's how you spark new ideas, new research projects, and that's how you have the most exciting conversations. But maybe that's something that we will be able to do through Zoom and other technology.
What about for you, Frank? I mean, you as a writer, you spend a lot of time at home anyway writing. What will change in the future, do you think?
For me? Gosh, I mean, I'm very, very comfortable with the whole Zoom thing in the sense that I hate being away from home. And I love being able to talk to schools that are far away. That's been a really wonderful experience for me. Although it's left me very unprotected. Like I said, geography's been a great barrier, like a great defense for me. It does leave you very vulnerable, and it's much harder to protect your writing time. From a religion point of view, that has been a pain, you know, because like I don't mean a pain in the bum. I mean like it's been painful because the center of it is sacrament, and it's about presence, and it's about physically being somewhere. Like the Allegri Miserere was only ever played in the Sistine Chapel. If you wanted to hear it, you had to go to Rome and hear it. And there's still that, you know, you can't really have the full experience without being there. And that's true socially as well, because all I know from going to mass on a Sunday is the counter in the corner. I don't know who's there or how they're looking, or if they're feeling sad or looking great. You know, I don't have that kind of the community in the definition that we were talking about at the beginning, where you have to rub along with people who are in a different social class, different political ideology, different outlook, different age group from you. I think the parish has kind of almost been the last bastion of that kind of community in Britain, because as we've sort of separated into gated suburbs, demographics and settled into that, the parish has been a great challenge to that. And of course that goes, although it's quite funny, like I know that like there is a counter in the corner, and I know that my mum goes to mass in like that's the thing we're saying, like go to mass in, like I've been going to mass in Edinburgh, whereas my mum's been going to mass in Overbury Street in Liverpool, and I know that she looks at that counter and talks going, oh, a lot of people came late, or oh, they left very early. And it's like, well, actually no, that she's just watching her eyes up in that corner all the time, watching the counter going.
Now, what about you? We were talking earlier about fake news, conspiracies, etc., etc. How does social science address some of these issues? Does it need to? You know, how big a problem is it? Is it just people having a bit of fun, or are there people who seriously believe some of this, and therefore it really is a challenge for us to overcome this pandemic?
I think it is a serious concern, and one of my colleagues, Mark Green in geography, is doing a brilliant project looking at misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're using Twitter and Facebook feeds. So we've have access to some of that data, and we're analysing it to look at patterns about when these sort of stories get started and how they're spread, and whether they're more common in certain sections of societies and communities. So it is more worrying. I think if you look back to the last big pandemic that we had in Britain, and people always go, oh, 2009, and it wasn't. It was 1968, Hong Kong influenza, when we had an excess mortality of 80,000. And people have just completely forgotten about it. Yeah. And that's partly because at the time there was very little media interest or coverage of it. So people got on with their lives. They weren't looking for those explanations. And I think a lot of the fuel for the sort of misinformation, the fake news, is because people just want that constant buzz from hearing something new all the time. And they'll go and they'll follow, Twitter feeds down all sorts of holes that will take them to places that probably aren't very reliable.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, I think the pandemic has put pressure on a lot of things in a way that's sort of revealing. So it's put pressure on race and class and in ways. But I think one really interesting thing is that at a point at which a lot of mainstream politics seems to sort of almost dispense with the idea of truth. Truth has suddenly become extremely important. You need to know. And I feel that nobody does know really what's going on. And that kind of febrile atmosphere of distrust that's created is a curveball. That's amazing about Hong Kong flu. One thing that Camus says in the Plague is that plagues and wars happen all the way through history. But every time, and lots and lots, I mean, I've become very aware of this, there are a lot of plagues in history. Every single plague comes as a surprise. It's like, whoa. This is never the hell. This is the end of the world. It's like, well, no, it happened 10 years ago. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, you've forgotten. Like, that's how not the end of the world it was, And this is like, it feels apocalyptic in theatre, and you can figure that. Like in Shakespeare's time, theatres were closed for 6 years because of the plague, and we've still got we've still got all those plays. So I mean, people got hurt.
You talked about theatre earlier in the arts. Do you think? Clearly some places are closing and struggling, and you said, this might be a game changer and things may not come back, or do you think they'll just operate in different ways in the future?
I think there's an opportunity completely to reinvent things, which is very, 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 very exciting. And the Shakespeare Theatre did reinvent itself, but in a way that, looking back now, we probably wouldn't like. It became less the Globe, plebeian, big crowds, and more the kind of court, elite theatres. I think, it does need to be addressed. I think, there's a lot of, we need to talk about what's at the end of that rainbow. you know, the rainbow in the window. Well, what is over the rainbow? Is it just troubles melting like lemon drops? You know, we kind of need to give some thought into what it could be, as that war generation did, you know, and came out of that war and built the NHS.
The war generation certainly did. I don't know if after previous pandemics, and 68 was a pandemic, but maybe wasn't quite so catastrophic or so changing. I guess the better example is the 1918 flu pandemic. I don't know, Sally, I don't know if you know if after that pandemic there were the kind of changes like we saw after World War II, you know, the kind of big societal shifts. Were there similar things after the 1918 pandemic?
Well, there were, but they were mixed up with the end of the First World War as well. I think what's interesting parallel with 1918 is that we had some similar situations. So we had a really not really dysfunctional, a disjuncture between levels of authority. So we had no one national government department responsible for health. We had some powers with local authorities, but not all of them. There wasn't a clear chain of command, and people didn't know quite who was in charge. I think we have seen an element of that again with this pandemic. I think epidemics are really useful litmus tests of what the underlying tensions are in society. And what worries me about this one is how it is going to exacerbate the existing inequalities that we have, particularly within Liverpool. I think that's a very worrying possibility.
And that's one aspect you're studying at the moment through some of your social science research.
It is, yes. I mean, we've got a long-standing research agenda around health inequalities in Liverpool in the northwest, but it's the things that people don't think of. It's the impact on education for individual children if they don't have that access to technology that we expect all children to have these days. It's the lack of access to school meals. So there's such a wide health impact from an epidemic that goes beyond just the impact of the virus on an individual body.
Yeah. Let me just, I'm told that 40 minutes is the ideal time for a podcast, and we're at 40 minutes. Perhaps we've got 2 minutes left because we started 2 minutes late. But let me just, I mean, we've had some fantastic questions and comments in, and what we will do is at the end we can capture them all so that we can potentially get back to people. Let me just share a few with you both and with everyone else that's listening. COVID's rekindled an interest in trust in experts, which was eroded in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. That's from Carol. I don't know if I'm meant to be giving people's names. I should have checked.
First names is fine.
First names is okay. John says, we've never been so vulnerable to pandemics, but we're also capable of handling it. Absolutely, Frank, says Lorna. What could our world be? I'm excited, especially by a rethink of higher education in the context of societal developments. Yeah, you like that. From Peter on Facebook, how can schools better educate our children to filter out fake news? There's clearly, surely some work to be done there, isn't there?
Huge,
Misinformation's coming from the press. They seem accountable to no one. Well, that was always the way, wasn't it? From John, one of the government and its acolytes excuse. No, I won't go down that one. I mean, I think I also didn't check with my controllers. I think I've had a bit of a steer not to be too controversial and political. We could do that another day, but there are probably people better placed to manage such a podcast than me. Although I mean, your comment, Frank, about Churchill, and you know, after the war he was ditched pretty promptly, and you mentioned the Dominic Cummings effect on the way people have viewed the whole thing. And personally, I think you're right in that sense, that it has changed a little bit how people feel.
Yeah.
Whereas everyone was trying to follow the rules. Certainly, if people's instincts tell them otherwise, then they may be behaving a bit differently.
Well, it just seemed very similar to the smoking minister.
Yeah, you know? Yeah, really interesting parallels. But you do wonder whether at the end of this pandemic, you know, just as the Prime Minister during World War II was thrown out soon afterwards, you do wonder what the future holds. But we're keeping away from politics, or at least hard politics. Question about how you feel this has impacted, for both of you, on the mental health of the population and young people especially. I mean, Frank, you're interacting with schools.
Yeah, and also individuals. I've been doing these creative writing lessons online on Instagram, and I kind of pointed them away from artistic achievement towards mental resilience. They were all about, you know, exploring your house and dealing with sort of the fact that you know where you are can always be wonderful and interesting if you're awake to it. So that encouraging creativity it is a way of encouraging mental resilience as well as I'm not interested in like people having careers in arts. It was more about kind of helping people think about their situation in different ways. It's a great line in Rilke. It says that if you think where you are is boring, that's because you haven't woken its soul. And so those lessons were about trying to get kids to waken the soul of wherever they were. And they've been hugely, I mean, like the numbers were great, but also the kind of the passion and the response of those kids it was really interesting, you know. So creativity does definitely have a role to play.
Okay, thanks. Great. Well, we are at our 40 minutes now, bang on. So I will call our discussion to an end there. At least the podcast will. I think we could be discussing for another few hours, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely.
But I mean, thanks both very much for joining me. I have some closing comments here. Firstly, I need to let everybody know that this has been recorded, and when the recording's available, people will be emailed so that they can share it with their friends. We'll be doing this again, I think. I mean, I had said if it was a total disaster, we won't do it again, but it feels to me like it's gone okay. No, those two are shaking their heads.
Yes.
Oh, rubbish.
Next Wednesday, we have a slightly different event, but it's called Liverpool Responds, and it's organised by the university centrally with the Vice-Chancellor, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Health and Life Science, Louise Kenny, and also, I think I'm on that one as well, discussing how the university's responded to COVID. But for the moment, I will thank you both for coming on. It's been very interesting and great fun. I thank all the audience for listening. And if I was technologically able, I would now play out the closing music, but I don't think I am. But maybe one of the technical people will do that.
Could we hum?
We could all hum instead. Yeah. Oh, here we are. He's going to have a go. Let's see if the music comes in.